are made by the community.
Sorry to cut you off.
Yes, go ahead, please.
But this has been building for years, according to this Global News article. It's been going on for over a decade, and probably well before that, before some of these figures came to light. So what has been done in the department? Like, this can't be news to people in the department that this is all of a sudden bad. And I'm not blaming anyone at the table. I'm just saying that this has been going on for decades. How is this still going on? This must have come across somebody's desk.
That's a great question. Thank you. I think that there is general recognition. I think we see it in the department. The Supreme Court said it. The number of children, Indigenous children in care in Canada, is a shocking number. There is no doubt about that. I think what the Act has tried to do over the past 5 years is to address that the system does not work as it is, and that there needs to be a huge systemic change where communities take control of child and family services, and then those decisions relating to that are under the community's control.
Okay, we're out of, that's the 6 minutes. Okay, we're going to go now to Mr. Batiste for his 6 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that presentation. I know that noticed the presentation you talked a lot about the government response to what the case said, but not a lot as about what the case actually said. I'm wondering if you could give us what are the 3 big takeaways from the department on what this case said.
Well, perhaps I'll defer to my Department of Justice colleagues and I can fill in at the end. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. I can provide, if it's helpful, a summary of the main points of the decision, if that's helpful, or of the opinion of the Supreme Court. So certainly on February 9th, the SEC rendered its unanimous opinion on the Act. The reference question before the court was quite specific, and I think that's something important to recognize. So the court was specifically asked whether the Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and families was ultra vires the jurisdiction of the Parliament of Canada under the Constitution Act. And the Supreme Court of Canada's answer to that question was no, it was not ultra vires. So in doing so, the court, in its opinion, confirmed that the Act as a whole is constitutionally valid under Section 91(24), and that includes the national standards set out in the Act, the affirmation of inherent right of self-government, which includes legislative authority over child and family services, and the incorporation by reference of certain Indigenous laws into federal law, and the giving of those laws of paramountcy over provincial and territorial laws. The court significantly found that it was not necessary for purposes of determining the specific reference question before them to determine whether or not the right of self-government is indeed a right recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act. The analysis then in the reference opinion, again, concerns the Act as a whole. The court applied a 2-part test to determine the Act's constitutional validity. So it identified the pith and substance, or the essential character of the Act, and then it classified it by reference to the heads of power in the Constitution Act 1867. And it found that the essential matter of the Act involves protecting the well-being of Indigenous children, youth, and families by promoting the delivery of culturally appropriate child and family services, and in so doing, that it was advancing the process of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. So the court found that that falls squarely within Parliament's legislative jurisdiction under 91(24). And it also found that the 3 features of the Act were all measures that were also within Parliament's exclusive legislative jurisdiction. So the establishment of national standards and principles, the affirmation that was set out in Section 18(1) of the Act, that the inherent right of self-government is an Aboriginal right recognized and affirmed by 35, and the framework to facilitate the implementation of Indigenous laws, notably by giving paramountcy to certain Indigenous child and family services laws over provincial laws. So I can go on and elaborate on those points, but I recognize there's
I want to take you on a different journey on this case, because this case was one of the first ones as a former Indigenous academic who taught Aboriginal and treaty rights. It was the first time I saw the Supreme Court of Canada use words like braiding of legal norms when they talked about the braiding of Canadian law with the Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People and Indigenous laws, and that moving forward, the law has to look at braiding these legal traditions together all in one. And I thought, can you speak to what that potential means for legislation moving forward or laws in Canada? I read it as saying that the Supreme Court is giving direction to parliamentarians to saying that when we look at laws, that we also have to look at the Indigenous laws themselves and the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People together with those laws. Would you agree with that kind of summarization of it? Because you have about 2 minutes left to kind of explore this concept that was unique to this case that I haven't seen in any other legal case before.
It may be most efficient in our 2 minutes to refer you to my colleague Valerie Phillips, who works quite a great deal on the UN Declaration.
Thank you for the question. It is an interesting statement by the court. They really talk about that in terms of legislative reconciliation, and they talk about that in the broader role of Parliament and parliamentarians. They make reference to the ability of Parliament to have a conversation with society and the courts, and how in passing laws like C-92, even if, for example, they do find that they make findings around the self-government affirmation, there's still a message being sent by parliamentarians to society and the courts. So in terms of what that means in terms of the larger interpretation of Canadian law and the braiding of laws, I think that remains to be seen. They don't provide specific guidance, but it certainly is giving a message that the UN Declaration should be considered by courts in interpreting laws and should be part of parliamentarians' consideration of laws.
20 seconds.
I'll get back to you on a third round on following up on legislative reconciliation. Get ready.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to Monsieur Lemire, and when you're ready, you have 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Well, indeed, I will continue in the same vein. Many people say that there are still practices that are not acceptable, that Indigenous children are being subjected or rather removed from their societies, from their communities, and children should be better protected. The overrepresentation of Indigenous children in care can be attributed to a political system which is guided by Eurocentric opinions, but also by governments, successive governments, that did not really deal with the underlying causes of this poverty. So there is need for a fundamental paradigm change, and living together also means developing together and having faith in Indigenous communities and giving them financial predictability so that they can introduce measures to help families and children, that they will develop themselves to improve the sort of children. And they should also have the capacity to develop and deliver their own services. So these are some elements that I noted from my conversations from different groups and communities. When we look at your graph, we see that more than $200 million have been spent to develop these capacities, but how much money has really been delivered to Indigenous communities to date? Thank you for the question. It's a really good question. In terms of capacity building, we're looking at $200 million plus the number exact. The exact number, you have it in the document. And in total, there's also a $1.6 billion envelope. But I do agree with you that it requires financing that is a bit represents outside the box thinking, if you will. And the target of this act is to promote, really, that's one of the principles of the act, to allow the community so that they have the means to face the big questions and challenges, the important and difficult obstacles in their way. They should be able to decide where they want to put their resources and what they would like to prioritize to offer different services for children. While statistics are really alarming, 54% of children who are in care in Canada are Indigenous, but they represent only 8% of the youth population in Canada. So the opinion, of course, deserves respect, but we have to ask the question about the implementation of certain elements that have to do with the implementation of the criminal code. Some of these are within the jurisdiction of provinces, as long as it doesn't go beyond 2 years in terms of the prison sentence. So the question that remains before us, even after this opinion, is how can Indigenous communities really assume this responsibility of taking care of children and the youth? Because we're probably going to need billions of dollars. Will the federal government really play that role and really allow Indigenous communities to fully assume these responsibilities? Thank you for the question. I think we're still studying the decision, the ruling. I can pass it on to my colleagues to answer more detailed questions about financing, but there needs to be a better coordination between provinces, territories, and the federal government and the different communities to make sure that they all come together and work together to provide the right child and family services. And of course, financing should also be part of that effort. Thank you for the question. I'm going to answer in English to make sure that I'm conveying precise information.
Speak specifically to finance and funding of the program. I think that is what your question was. They don't speak specifically to that.
That is the problem, because now we're in a political matter, and we all are trying to, of course, favor the self-determination of Indigenous communities. But if we're not taking the responsibility of who's going to pay, at the end of the day, it's the Indigenous child who will be the most impacted potentially by this. And if the bill is again sent once again to Quebec, then that digs deeper into the financial injustices. So will the federal government take or assume its responsibilities in line of with this decision? So who will pay for it? That is a very good question. And if we look at the Child and Family Services program, we see that there's been a 200% or so increase in the financing for these programs to make sure that there's a certain level of financing funds available that will be made available to Indigenous communities in Canada. And when you look at the agreements that have been signed to date, you also see that there's financing that meets the needs. It's communities who indicate what their needs are. They build their own models and priorities. So the objective here is to make sure that the financing is over the long term. We have 10-year agreements with many communities. So we're trying to make sure that it's not just going to be there for the next year or the 2 years. I'd like to hear you a bit about the consultation mechanisms with Quebec specifically. Are you going to share the tripartite consultation meetings and the information coming from that? Will you make that information public? Well, thank you for the question. I think we need to refer to our colleagues from the Department of Justice, and these are agreements with the communities, and we cannot, of course, do that unilaterally without their consentments.
It's the end of the time. Okay, we'll now go to Ms. Gazan. Sorry, Leah.
Oh, no.
Ms. Gazan,
it's like you
the floor is yours
combined
for
both
6
my
minutes.
names there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for being here today. My first question, you spoke about capacity building, and I'm looking at Government of Canada website about the funding for capacity building. Is it not proposal dependent?
Thank you for your question.
Just say yes and no,
Yes,
just because I have.
It is proposal dependent at this time, yes.
So just because a community submits a proposal wanting to build capacity so that they can obtain jurisdiction doesn't mean they're actually going to be supported for it. Is that right?
To date, communities are typically supported for it, yes.
Okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean they will be. Is it a guarantee when they put in a proposal that they will be provided what is needed to build capacity? Yes.
There's certain criteria that must be met.
Okay, so no.
Yes.
Okay, so just moving on, it says that, it says yearly maximum funding as per funding chart below, the number of proposals received. So it goes actually farther to say, like, let's say everybody met the criteria, but there wasn't, it would still depend on the number of proposals received and the total funding available. How much funding is currently available?
The current funding is $100 million per year.
$100 million a year. So